What a beautiful day it's been, and we appreciate your interest in wanting to study and learn more of God's Word. You know, secular history tells us that Caesars and kings and presidents shape our world. But in 1809, we find that stories dominated the headlines about Napoleon's campaigns. But the world's destiny was being shaped in the cradles of the world. What do we mean by that? We see in 1809, William Gladstone was born. He was a famous statesman of England. Alfred Lloyd Tennyson was born, and he shaped the literary world. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Darwin, Abe Lincoln were all born in 1809. Well, today I would like to discuss with you of when God became real. Because you see, all of these births were insignificant at that time because the destiny was being shaped by Napoleon. Well, in 1 BC, Augustus Caesar, who was very powerful, as a matter of fact, he transformed the world, not just Rome. Well, he decreed that a census was to be taken. We read about this in Luke chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. Now think about that for a minute, because no one at that time imagined that God was going to enter the world. You see, the insignificance of Christ's birth is confusing for some. There are some who hardly even believe in his birth at all. But we know that in Luke chapter 1, verse 37, it says, "For with God nothing shall be impossible." We also find that it wasn't unusual for heavenly beings to appear in different forms. Angels had appeared as men to Abraham. They spoke to Balaam through a donkey. And we know that these heavenly beings appeared in a fiery furnace in Daniel. Take a look at Luke chapter 1, verse 28. "And the angel came in unto her," referring to Mary. He said, "Hail, thou that art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women." And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying. And she cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. But the angel said, "Fear not. Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus." You see, heavenly beings, they don't have the limitations that we have. Now, the difficulty is really not in the virgin birth. We know that with God, all things are possible. And the virgin birth does not question my belief in God's power. The question that we have on our minds is, why did God send his Son? Well, in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, he says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so that death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." So we find that it was necessary because of sin for God to send his Son. Because sin, as the Bible tells us, it separates us from God. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, he says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Now think about this for a minute. Adam and Eve had but one thing that they couldn't do. Just one thing that was restricted of them. but we know that they fell in the garden. But why would this separation, because of sin, because of this death, why would this separation demand the sending of God's Son? Well, with all of the authority that God had, with all of the power that God has, couldn't He have just straightened things out with an order? You know, we think about our presidents, and sometimes if things go amiss or things go a different way, they give an executive order to try to straighten things out. Well, couldn't God have done that? In Genesis chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. And it repented the Lord that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him at His heart. So what did the Lord say? He said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But you see, remember, at the time of Jesus' birth, Caesar had brought the world to its feet with a census. Now think about our natural disasters today. If you're going to send Jesus into the world, why not bring Him into the world with a robe and a crown and place Him in some ivory palace? Why would you have the Prince of Peace and the Lord of Lords born in a cattle stall? You see, God didn't grab the headlines with His Son's birth. As a matter of fact, He was born to a race that most of the world considered despicable. Some think that He was even born in questionable circumstances because of the virgin birth. They didn't understand that. So why would you have Christ living with a poor family, at least 9 other people in the house? Why would He be deprived of riches of an earthly prince that He so deserved? You know, Luke tells of Zacharias, who we know he was a priest, and he would go into the holy place to offer incense and prayers. But you see, God removes this distance that had always existed between man and God. He removed that distance through Christ. We can now enter the presence of God ourselves. We find that Christ comes in the most ordinary way so that He can identify with the most ordinary of humanity. So much for this cosmic God that people might have a vision of. Jesus didn't come with no halo, no shining armor, no flashy clothes, no flaming sword. As a matter of fact, many knew Him as just an ordinary guy, not the Son of God. We read about this in Mark chapter 6, verses 2 through 3. And when the Sabbath day was come, Jesus began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing Him were astonished, and they said, From whence hath this man these things? And what wisdom is this which is given unto Him, that even such mighty works are wrought by His hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and of Judah and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And so they were offended at Him. So why a human birth? Wouldn't it have been better if He had just come in some kind of alien presence? Wouldn't this have demonstrated His wisdom and His power? But you know, some people always fantasize about the way that things should be, or the way things should have occurred. The Jews even had their own fantasies about what Christ should be, about what their Messiah should be. In John chapter 10, beginning with verse 31, Then the Jews took up stones again to stone Him. But Jesus answered and said, many good works have I showed you from my Father. For which of those works are you stoning me? Well, the Jews said, we're not stoning you for the good works that you've done. We're stoning you for blasphemy. And because that thou, being a man, makest thyself God. You see, Jesus didn't fit their idea of what their Messiah would be. In Matthew chapter 26, beginning with verse 63, but Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether you be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said, well, you've said it. But nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And then what did the high priest do? They tore their clothes, and they're saying that he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. But you see, Christ's birth brought humanity back to reality. When Christ came, this is when the Word became real. Think for a moment. Have you ever met some famous movie star or some military hero? Or how about some famous person of the past that has passed on? Someone you've probably never met. Well, imagine, if you can, a world where God is so distant, so unapproachable. But you see, when Christ became flesh, that's when God became real to men. He breathed the same air that we breathe. It was now deity has become human. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5, he says, there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ. That enabled Christ to be our mediator. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, it says, behold, a virgin shall be with child and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is being interpreted, God with us. So here we have deity now walking on the earth with man, breathing the same air. There has never been a time when God was closer or more real than when Jesus walked the earth. Now, don't get me wrong. God has always been there. God is real. But now he is human as he is divine. God is just as real as he was with Adam and Eve. But when Jesus came, we find that God became man. He now demonstrated, if you will, the breadth, the depth, and the height of his true existence. We read in John chapter 1, verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. You see, Christ didn't come to this earth for some photo shoot. He didn't come to talk about people's problems. He came and he shared the ill effects of sin. He didn't briefly come and visit the destruction site. He himself experienced the loss, and he shared in the reality of our humanity. We have some comforting words in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. It says, "For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted, like as we are, yet without sin." So you see, we do have a God that understands what it's like. He understands what we have to go through every day that we're here. So that means also that come Judgment Day, we won't have an excuse. We won't be able to say, "God, you just don't know what it's like to be me. God, you just don't know what it's like to have to deal with the temptations that I had to deal with." That excuse will no longer exist. And his birth, as we talked about earlier, and his appearance as a man, it may seem strange to some, but we know that it was God's plan for it to be that way. You see, but God is now no longer born of man as Jesus was. We find now that men and women are now born of God, because God is reborn in each of us when we're obedient to His will. So now we have, if you will, the rebirth of humanity. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God." He continues in chapter 5, beginning with verse 4. "For whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world. And this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. Who is he that overcometh the world? But he that believeth that Jesus is the Son of God." We also read in John chapter 1, beginning with verse 11, "He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." It's interesting because when the Pharaohs and the Caesars would proclaim their deity, that would leave other people out. But you see, God didn't work that way. God's purpose was to make all of us His sons and daughters. He came so that we could partake of His divine nature. Peter talks about this in 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 3. He said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to His abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that's incorruptible, undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you." He also says in 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 3, "According as His divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness, through the knowledge of Him that hath called us to glory and virtue, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust." Imagine partaking of that divine nature of God. But His death, Jesus' death and His resurrection, has made our rebirth possible. We have an opportunity to share in His holiness. But we must accept it because we are agents of free will. And you know, there's a lot going on in our world today. And as the world continues to exist, there will always be something going on. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, he says, "Behold, I stand at the door, and I knock. If any man hear my voice, and open the door, I will come into him, and will sup with him, and he with me." So you see, I have a responsibility. I have to open that door and let Jesus in. I have to be obedient to His will. In Ephesians chapter 2, he begins in verse 8, he says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." You see, I can't earn my place in heaven, but I do have to have an obedient faith. That's exactly what Abraham had, was an obedient faith. You know, the most important thing shaping our world is God's influence in your life and in your heart. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, it says, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear Him. Fear Him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So are we going to allow God to influence our lives? Are we going to allow God to influence our heart so that we can shape this world into a place that He would be proud of until that day that we live with Him in heaven? Because Jesus said in John chapter 14, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Thank you so much for your attention. We encourage you to learn more of God's desires for you, and we would be happy to help in any way. Have a blessed day.